Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? Or something like it. Has to be up there as one of the more referenced phrases commonly believed to have been spoken by an historical figure. It's used, I think, almost as a shorthand for an event that rocked 12th century England and indeed Christendom as a whole to its very core. On this channel, we have spoken at length about a certain King Henry and his conflict with the Roman Catholic Church. We've looked at how that conflict destroyed the friendship between that king and his formerly favoured churchman, Thomas. How that Thomas, in turn, was brought down completely. 3 centuries before Thomas Wolsey was discarded by King Henry VIII, another King Henry, Henry II, fell out spectacularly and ultimately fatally with his Thomas Becket. And as a side note, Wolsey's achievement of arms included 2 chuffs, which were themselves connected to Thomas Becket and his legacy, so echoing down the ages there. Today, we're going to take a look at the life, death and legacy of the man, later the saint, that Thomas Wolsey and many others were so keen to connect themselves with. Let's take a look at the turbulent priest himself, Thomas Becket. Religious tradition holds that Thomas Becket was born on the 21st December 1120 in Cheapside, London, to Norman parents Gilbert and Matilda. Thomas's father was a merchant who, by the time of Thomas's birth, was able to earn a living from the rents that were paid on his property holdings. The Becket family lived in a salubrious area surrounded by other wealthy and influential Londoners. Thomas was seemingly offered a variety of prestigious educational opportunities. However, it is suggested that he may not have made the most of them, that he instead preferred the more physical pastimes of hunting and hawking, that he was more focused on worldly concerns, on the lives of courtiers and knights. He was said to be handsome, charming, and fond of fashionable dress, which would win him praise from some sectors and censure from others. A Norman baron, Richard de l'Aigle, took an interest in the young Becket. This baron would allow Becket to accompany him on various hunting and hawking jaunts that he took to the English countryside. This was a relationship that no doubt would have provided Becket with an experience of how to mix with, and so appeal to, members of the nobility. And surely that would have been a useful foundation for Becket's future career. In his early to mid-20s, Becket kept the accounts for a banker in London. But then, he secured a place as a clerk in the household of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who at that time was Theobald of Bec. He soon occupied a position of immense trust and favour. Theobald saw to it that Becket was sent to study law on the continent. He would also send him on missions to the papal curia. When Theobald managed to advance his archdeacon to the vacant Archbishopric of York in 1154, he chose to make Becket his archdeacon in his place. This was a role that came with various benefices, and in their turn, they proved to be very profitable for the new incumbent. At the end of 1154, on the 19th of December to be exact, a new king was crowned. Henry, son of the Empress Matilda, became King Henry II, and soon Thomas Becket would be this new king's man. He would be his chancellor. The professional relationship between them soon flourished into a very strong personal friendship. Henry had come to the throne at 22 years old. Thomas Becket was around 12 years his new king's senior. Those churchmen who had pushed Becket forward for royal service had apparently hoped to have an inside man, someone who might curb some of this young king's impulses, who might, they hoped, even be able to persuade him to support rather than to challenge the church. And so I imagine there were probably quite a few pretty disappointed people. Thomas Becket and Henry II were soon nearly inseparable. At work and at play, they were together. Becket was very clearly the king's man, or at least he was at this point. Royal favour and the gifts that came with it would only serve to enrich him further. Henry sent Becket on prestigious diplomatic missions, like the one to the French king in 1158. And then the year after that, in 1159, Becket had command of 700 knights for Henry's campaign to take Toulouse. Becket was still busy soldiering abroad at the start of 1161. And during that same period, the man who had made him his archdeacon, who had so promoted him, Archbishop Theobald, was experiencing his final illness. Although they had both been called for, neither Becket nor the king would make time to visit this archbishop before it was too late. Apparently, Archbishop Theobald and King Henry II both thought that Thomas Becket should be the next Archbishop of Canterbury, replacing Theobald. Now, we do know that he had been favoured by Theobald, so perhaps this desire for his promotion in this regard makes sense. And as for the king, in his mind, this is going to be the very best case scenario. After all, to have a friendly, biddable individual placed in the most significant ecclesiastical role in England, that's going to be helpful to any monarch. I think we can all understand that. And it's especially going to be helpful to a monarch who doesn't always get on with his church. Thomas Becket, though, was apparently less keen. He enjoyed courtly life, and certainly the rewards it brought. To be accepted as Archbishop of Canterbury, he's going to have to face down monastic opposition from Canterbury's Benedictine community, because they were the ones who claimed responsibility for electing Archbishops of Canterbury. Theobald, during his time in that role, had repressed their convent, and Thomas Becket had helped, and so Becket was not particularly popular with these individuals. On top of this, Becket, if he was elevated to this role, would be the first non-monk since the conquest to hold the position. Nevertheless, Thomas Becket's reluctance, like that of the clergy, would be fully overridden by the 23rd of May 1162, because on that date, Becket's election to the See of Canterbury was confirmed. He was ordained as a priest on the 2nd of June and was consecrated as Archbishop of Canterbury on the following day, the 3rd of June 1162. It does appear that Becket would apparently have been permitted to hold on to his archdeaconry and also to continue on as Henry's Chancellor. Now, in the case of the archdeaconry, this would have meant that all the perks, offices and benefices from this other ecclesiastical office would have remained Becket's, things for him to continue to profit from. Holding more than one ecclesiastical office is a practice known as pluralism, and while it is a practice that certainly happened, frequently as it would turn out, because it functioned as a way to ensure that members of the clergy could earn a good enough living, this practice often resulted in absenteeism, where ecclesiastical livings would sit idle, essentially vacant, but looked after by somebody, meaning that there's nobody on the ground dealing with things. Things start to fall behind. Whole dioceses could technically have nobody looking after them properly, and thus problems could arise. This, I think understandably, is why the practice generated criticism, and technically it was not something that was allowed to happen. And so perhaps then it was Becket's conscience that caused him to renounce both the archdeaconry and the chancellorship. The less charitable interpretation is that Becket now considered both of these roles to be beneath him. However, it is also possible that he was compelled to resign them by King Henry II, who may, apparently, have already begun to experience concerns, even disappointment, with regard to this friend that he had just so promoted. Becket does appear to have been keen to throw himself into his new role. He sought advice on his theological studies. He ensured that he fulfilled all his duties. In this regard, he was meticulous. He spent time in private prayer and contemplation. It was evident, I think, that he fully intended to be the very best Archbishop of Canterbury that he could possibly be, and it does seem that for him that meant in large part adding to or recovering the magnificence and prominence of his see. And so the household was expanded. He packed it with clerks, knights, sons of the nobility, and numerous servants. This was magnificence in the extreme. He went on to enrage some powerful barons by reclaiming lands and estates that had once been in the control of the See of Canterbury, but had since been granted to, or leased, or even usurped by members of the laity, powerful members of the laity. As early as 1163, I think that buyer's remorse was taking hold for King Henry II, and his rift with Thomas Becket began to expand. Before long, that rift would prove to be an untraversable chasm. By that point, king and archbishop were bitterly opposed to each other in numerous causes, but perhaps at the core of the dispute were the customs, privileges, and indeed authority of the church and the papacy. The king was, for example, infuriated that membership of holy orders theoretically rendered an individual answerable only to ecclesiastical courts and to canon law. These individuals were thus protected from being tried and punished in secular courts, even for crimes that would have carried a capital penalty. This was known as benefit of clergy, which is something that I have mentioned in previous videos. At the so-called Council of Clarendon of January 1164, King Henry II drafted constitutions that were designed to steer ecclesiastical procedures in his dominions in the direction that he desired. The king was determined that Becket, who had opposed him in this change, as he had in so many other things, would firmly and finally be brought to heel. While Becket avoided setting his seal to this particular document, he did agree to observe it. However, in this agreement, he viewed himself as having sinned to such a degree that he should no longer be able to perform his ecclesiastical role, that he should instead have to do penance and have his behaviour referred to the Pope. He saw to all of these things on his own behalf. Becket certainly recognised the risk that he was generating for himself, for his person. He first attempted to flee to the Pope on the continent just before the autumn of 1164. Then, at the start of the October of that same year, Thomas Becket was summoned to Northampton Castle to answer accusations that he had variously subverted the path of justice, disobeyed his king, and misused royal funds. Becket, apparently fearing for his life and or his liberty, upon the assumption that he would be found guilty in these proceedings, asked the Pope to intercede on his behalf. King Henry, for his part, also appealed to the Pope, asking him to remove the Archbishopric of Canterbury from Thomas Becket. In appealing to the Pope, Henry asserted that Becket had acted in contravention of the Clarendon constitutions. Slightly hypocritical, though, as he had just done the same thing, but we will let that pass. Ultimately, Thomas Becket fled from Northampton and indeed from England. On the afternoon of the 2nd of November 1164, Thomas Becket landed on the continent, and he promptly sought the protection of Louis VII, the King of France. He also looked to meet with and gain the support of the Pope. With Becket in this self-imposed exile and thus out of King Henry II's reach, the enraged English king did what he could to cut Becket off from financial support, and so his lands and his possessions were all confiscated. In 1165, Thomas Becket used the powers that he still had at his disposal to launch his own attack. And so he excommunicated and placed under interdict all those that he felt had acted against him, with the exclusion of King Henry II. In response to these sentences, an appeal was made to the Pope. This Pope, Alexander III, had frankly more than enough of his own troubles to face, and so he was very keen to find some diplomatic solution to this Henry Becket problem, which would, as it turned out, still be very much rumbling on until 1170. Indeed, in that year, things seemed to reach a crescendo. Becket threatened to impose an interdict on the entire country, which, if adhered to, would deny all of Henry's subjects access to many religious rites and ceremonies. King Henry then escalated matters by subverting Becket's usual rights as Archbishop of Canterbury, by having the Archbishop of York perform the coronation ceremony for his son, Henry the Young King, which took place at Westminster Abbey on the 14th of June. Thomas Becket was, according to reports, utterly furious when he learned of this taking place. The special focus for his rage in this regard was, however, the churchmen who had been involved in bringing this particular ceremony to pass. So much so that now it was Becket who had a pressing desire to come to terms with Henry, in large part so that he could return to England and so use his ecclesiastical authority to deal with what he saw as his betrayers. And thus, a meeting between King Henry II and Thomas Becket resulted in a tenuous reconciliation. Becket returned to England towards the end of November or perhaps the start of December 1170. At this point, he had just weeks to live. Upon Becket's return, with his king having remained in France, Becket affirmed the excommunication of all those that he deemed to be involved in crowning the young king. He sought to reassert his authority in Canterbury, and before long there were concerns that he might use his desired visit to the young king as an opportunity to pronounce him dethroned, on account of his coronation ceremony having been performed by York rather than by himself. On top of this, Becket used the Christmas Day service to publicly, from the pulpit, denounce and excommunicate all those he believed had acted against him and against his rights as Archbishop of Canterbury. When King Henry II, who at that time was celebrating Christmas near Bayeux, heard about Becket's antics, he apparently complained loudly that all those he had promoted, who even now he was surrounding himself with, would allow their king to be treated so shamefully by one of such low birth. 4 of his knights took this apparently as an order to avenge their king. Now, quite what the king actually intended, in the heat of the moment or perhaps otherwise, can be debated, I think. Nevertheless, on the 29th of December 1170, these knights convened on Canterbury Cathedral. They had arrived there at around 2 in the afternoon. Thomas Becket was told of their arrival and chose to meet with them. Angry insults were thrown, and then, right by the altar, blows were struck. According to the reports, Thomas Becket was hacked by their swords, with the final blow taking off the top of his head, at which point his assailants chose to spread his brains across the floor. To pollute a holy place in this manner was shocking. Indeed, the act would render the cathedral unusable for religious services. On top of this, the brutal murder of the leading churchman in England was utterly horrifying. The shockwaves rippled out through Christendom. Within months, interdicts and excommunications had been pronounced by the Pope. This time, though, they included King Henry II in their scope. Henry had tried desperately to distance himself from this murder. He even went so far as to flee from France into Ireland, and he would remain there until 1172. As for the knights who were responsible for the murder itself, they were ordered by the Pope to go and serve on crusade in the Holy Land as a form of penance. Within days of Thomas Becket's death, it was already being reported that his blood had been shown to have miraculous powers of healing. Canterbury Cathedral reopened for Easter 1171. It, and Becket's shrine there, would soon become an increasingly popular destination for pilgrimage. Becket was made a saint with remarkable speed, just a little over 2 years after his death. The Pope canonised Becket on the 21st of February 1173. St Thomas, as he had now become, was thus still a looming presence in King Henry II's life and realm. And then, In the early 1170s, Henry found that he was utterly beset. He had rebellious sons and a rebellious wife. To make matters worse, their rebellion was being supported by a number of Henry's barons, by the kings of France and Scotland, and by a collection of powerful French counts. And so, perhaps we might all understand how, with all of this going on, King Henry II might well have concluded that he was the subject of some divine punishment following the murder of Thomas Becket. On the 12th of July, 1174, King Henry II chose to travel to Canterbury. There, he chose to walk barefoot through the city to Becket Shrine, thinking nothing of the injuries to his feet, the trail of blood he is said to have left behind. Upon arriving, he prostrated himself before Becket's tomb and permitted every monk to lash him. This was to be his penance. The following day, Henry received the news that his enemy, the Scottish king, had been captured. Even better, within months, the entire rebellion against him would melt away and his own sons would come to him begging for his forgiveness. Evidently, Henry must have assumed that his penance had been accepted, that God and St Thomas were back on his side. Henry would visit Becket Shrine numerous times after this. On occasion, he would attend the shrine in the company of very important pilgrims from the continent. Perhaps, though, the most significant of these arrived in the summer of 1179. Louis VII of France's 14-year-old son and heir Philip was at this point dangerously ill. Louis was clearly desperate and in need of a miracle, and thus he chose to visit the shrine of the man that he had once sheltered, in the hope that the reported healing properties might be able to benefit his dynasty. Upon hearing that Louis was coming, Henry rushed to meet him at Dover. He then accompanied him to Canterbury. Louis's pilgrimage had the desired effect, and Philip recovered. Indeed, he would live into his late 50s. King Henry II realised that the Shrine of St Thomas at Canterbury held powerful international significance. He also recognised that Dover was a natural landing point for many continental pilgrims who were bent on heading to Canterbury, and therefore Henry set about turning Dover Castle into one of the most luxurious spaces in England. It became a place to show off, to host the great and the good. It was, in effect, diplomacy in action. It was also, though, a way to show the continuation of King Henry II's penance, because the chapel of Dover Castle would be dedicated to St Thomas. However, in addition to this being a clear act of penitence, it is also, I think, a kind of reclaiming. Henry II's support of the Shrine of St Thomas, of the pilgrimages to it, and of the cult that sprung up around it, allowed him, arguably, to lay partial claim to its power. It allowed St Thomas to join St Edward and St Edmund as English saints who were firmly on Henry II's side. In some ways, then, Thomas Becket's murder and the subsequent recognition of him as St Thomas was something that became truly valuable to King Henry II, his nation, and his dynasty. So what do you think of the life, death, and legacy of Thomas Becket, of the choices he made, of his potential motivations, of the way that King Henry II chose to respond to his former friend both in life and in death? What do you think of this king's recognition of and support for Becket's legacy as St Thomas, the martyr that he was arguably responsible for creating? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. I'd also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will boost the engagement. And the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube shares it out, which will help us to grow our community. I'm a bit stumped as to which kind of emoji to go for, because I feel like there are some competing drives going on. Is this about faith or power? Power of faith? I wonder what you think. What is driving the events that we've talked about today? If you think faith, maybe pick something religious, perhaps a church. If you think it's about power, maybe choose a crown or a castle or a sword. I'm looking forward to seeing what you pick. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to the place you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends, and if you like the channel, let some pals know about it. You can tell me you like this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel, and if you think you are subscribed, now is the time to have a check to make sure you've not been mysteriously unsubscribed against your will by the YouTube gremlins. While you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down menu that will appear, and that way YouTube alleges they will tell you when I've next uploaded, but also when I am next going live, which I do to talk about the history news, and you are not going to want to miss that. We have now got our failsafe. If you head to my website, www.katrinamarchant.com, you can go to the contact page shown on screen. On that page, you will see a little box. If you put your email address in that box, you will be added to my mailing list, and I will send you an email once a week with things that I've been up to and also with useful links that you might want for the coming days. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.